And that's when we realized we're like, we can actually do some good with this modular development too. We can do affordable housing, and we can get the government to help pay for part of it. And in return, we can provide housing that's brand new quality, like Class A quality apartments and homes that families making, $30,000 a year can actually afford to live in. And that's when I dove all in. I went down the rabbit hole and I learned about tax credits, public-private partnerships, working with the government, working through all of that. And it's this like total niche within real estate. But that's where I found my passion.
Welcome to the Real Estate and Financial Independence Podcast. I'm your host, Chad Carson. You can also call me Coach, and this is a show all about helping you get out of the financial grind so you can do more of what matters. Whether you're a long-time listener or a first-time listener, it's always an honor to have you back for another episode. The title of today's episode is How One Investor is Making a Dent in the Affordable Housing Crisis While Also Making Money. This is an interview with Evan Holladay, and I want to take a step back that a big part of the podcast, the interest in this podcast for me, is that I get to learn from other people. I get to have conversations about topics that I'm intrigued by or that I feel like I don't know enough about. And if you've watched anything in the news, read articles, or just been aware of the United States and other countries as well, housing affordability is a big issue. And it's one of those complex problems that I'm still trying to get my head around. But I really feel strongly that we real estate investors are a part of the solution. And there's different ways that we might be able to help with that. But one particular way that I interviewed Evan about is he is a real estate developer, but development in the sense that his end product is affordable housing. So if you think about a typical development often has to do a little bit more luxury or higher prices because they're having to build expensive new housing. Well, his developments where he's trying to rent to people who can only afford affordable rents using a lot of creative strategies like federal tax credits and also working with local governments and local entities and local nonprofits. So just a really interesting conversation. Not only I asked him to help me figure out what the affordable crisis causes are, what's going on, that's a big question, but then also what his specific solution is and how some of you might be able to use some of these strategies, either in part or maybe go into something similar to what Evan's doing if you're motivated to help be part of the solution and also make money. There are nonprofits who do this kind of thing, but you as an investor who's also building financial independence, also building wealth, paying for a salary if you want to be in this business full time, can do it while also helping to solve a social problem. So really an intriguing topic, a great implementer, entrepreneur is what Evan is doing out in the real world. And so I'm looking forward to sharing this conversation with you. Now, before we get to the interview, it's time for my weekly behind the scenes segment where I share a short snippet of what's going on with me in my real estate, in my business, or behind the scenes personally. And this week, I want to share something very specific that I've been working on. You might remember from a couple of episodes ago that I shared just the steps we're having to take, my family and I, to go to Spain. Some of those are practical about this, preparing our visa and kind of getting ready to go abroad. But one of those was renting our house out. And so I want to talk about that and something very specific when you rent your own house out. Something I spent a lot of time on was taking good pictures and telling a story about the place where someone's going to live. So this is kind of interesting because I used to lease all of my properties myself. I took calls and I talked to tenants. I did all the marketing, put the signs out. I did all the online marketing. I've outsourced a lot of that to property managers who do a good job of that, but I haven't been as in touch with the day-to-day details. And so I did this one myself though, because we're leasing it ourselves. And it just reminded me of a key principle that I think will help you whether you're leasing your own rentals, which is kind of the context we're talking about here, or really if you're marketing anything. And the reminder to me was that when you sell a product, when you rent a product, you're always telling a story of the person who might be the buyer, or in this case, the renter for that product. Sometimes we get in the information business. We think we just got to tell all the information, like the features. This house has this many bedrooms, this many square feet. And those are important. You definitely want to have those, but you don't want to lead with that information. The pictures in particular, most of us are visual in terms of kind of understanding what's going on with a product, in this case, the house. Having a lot of pictures and having videos, if you can sometimes, tell a really great story. And you want to portray things, in this case, my house, the place where people are going to live, like my back porch overlooking the woods is a place I really enjoy in that house. Well, having a picture and telling a story about how you might experience that, the owls you might hear in the evening when you're sitting out there, or the backyard is not just a picture of the backyard, but it's like you might enjoy the garden in the backyard, and you can plant, tomato garden, or you can pick fruit from these fruit trees that we have in the backyard, really enjoy those in the summer. And so telling those kind of stories is just a little bit of an extra thing. But if somebody's looking at your listing online and they're imagining themselves there, that kind of frame of reference of telling stories is really what marketers do. That's what storytellers do. It's what anybody who's trying to persuade anyone to do. We think and we make decisions as a story receiving person. We've been doing that for millions of years as human beings. So I just want to convey that idea. It was a reminder for me. We actually leased the house in about a week. And I think, getting a lot of interest on a property, if it's already a good location, that's going to help. But having good pictures, having a good description, describing each scenario was a big part of that. So see if you can implement that in whatever context you have, whether you're renting houses or maybe some other business you have. Tell a story, put your listener as the hero of the story, tell them how they're going to benefit, what their experience is going to be like. I think you'll have an easier time selling your product or leasing it in this case. If you like these behind the scenes segments, I want to invite you to stay in touch with me beyond the podcast by checking out one of my online courses that I offer. Online courses are a way to interact with me and let me help you with your real estate investing. Some courses are available anytime, and others, like my premier course, Real Estate Deal School, is more of a boot camp style course where you and other students go through live with me as I help you step by step with purchasing your next investment property. You can get details on all of my courses at coachcarson.com/courses. Now let's get started with today's interview. Hey, Evan, welcome to the podcast.
Yes, thank you for having me on, Chad. Great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. I think we met. We were just talking briefly offline. I think a couple of years ago, we were at a Bigger Pockets conference, as I remember it, and I was fortunate enough to come on your podcast as well soon after that. So I'm looking forward to talking about specifically a topic that you're an expert on: affordable housing, how to develop affordable housing, how to help solve the affordable housing crisis, if we want to get really big picture with this. But I would love, Evan, for maybe just to tell us a little bit about your real estate background and what brought you to the point where you've become an affordable housing developer.
Yes, I love it. So a little bit about my background and how I got into real estate first. When I was in school, when I was in college, I was trying to go the pre-med route, going science and chemistry, and realized I hated both of those classes. And I was like, well, I got to find something that I'm passionate about. And I saw this student housing development going in on campus, or it was announced. And I was like, man, that sounds amazing. Like, you can literally build something out of nothing. You can change the face of a community, and you can impact the lives of everybody that lives there and the community for the next, 50 to 100 years. And so when I saw that, I was like, man, how do I get involved with something like that? And just through a chance connection, I was introduced to the developer, and he's like, well, you got to impress me if you want a job. So I ended up getting over 200 people out to his groundbreaking. And that's really what started. That's what got me my foot in the door. Was I impressed him. Of course, he didn't just give me a job right away. Even after that, I still had to follow up. But I knew I wanted to do it, and so I didn't give up on it. And so I worked with him for, I think, 2 years of college, and really got to see the behind the scenes of the development side, the property management side, really like the whole from A to Z of development. And that's where I was just hooked. I was like, all right, this is what I want to do. And then coincidentally, at the same time, I had an entrepreneurship class, and they're like, start a business, even if it's just on paper. And I was like, well, the guys, the people that were in my group, I'm like, guys, we need to do commercial real estate, like something within real estate, multifamily development. We got to do that. So we ended up doing modular development where they build it offsite. And we actually worked with a houseboat manufacturing plants in Kentucky, and they just laid off 1,100 skilled workers. So we're like, how could we put them back to work, use the same facilities, use the same rectangular shape of a houseboat, but just put it on a foundation instead of putting And, we were totally naive, like did not know anything about anything in real estate or construction or modular, but we just took action. And we honestly, we got a great board behind us. We assembled our own board, and that's really, they were like an open book to us. tell, anything we wanted to know from them, they shared with us. And that's when we realized we're like, we can actually do some good with this modular development too. We can do affordable housing, and we can get the government to help pay for part of it. And in return, we can provide housing that's brand new quality, like Class A quality apartments and homes that families making, $30,000 a year can actually afford to live in. And that's when I dove all in. I went down the rabbit hole and I learned about tax credits, public-private partnerships, working with the government, working through all of that. And it's this like total niche within real estate. But that's where I found my passion. And really from there, I started actually working for an affordable development company and was really one of the earlier employees. And while I was there, learned a whole lot. They put me in charge of development. And by the time I left, they were like the number one developer in the country, the number one affordable developer in the country. And that's where I got up close and personal. I got to kind of take like light year steps in my experience by learning from guys that had done, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of real estate. Like I was literally right down the hall from them, and I could lean on them on the projects I was working on. And so that's really where I cut my teeth and then eventually broke off and started my own company, Holladay Ventures, with the focus of how can we do affordable housing right? How can we be intentional developers? How can we do it with purpose and passion? So that way we're actually not just building the affordable housing, which is a key component to it, is just creating the unit, but also wrapping that with supportive services and resident empowerment. And so that's a big part of my why. That's a big part of my mission. I think helping families that are in need, a big portion of that starts with a stable place to call home. And so that's what really keeps us going and keeps us like the energy levels high and the passion high. And that's really what our core focus is.
Love so much about that story, Evan. And I'm just going to go back to this last part you talked about. I think one of the things that resonated with me about your business and your mission is the mission. And I think that's such a great example for all of us who are entrepreneurs, when you lead with your mission, it kind of attracts people who are interested in what you're all about. I mean, all the details are cool too, but just my personal kind of take on affordable housing. I've been working in the real estate investing space for 20 years. And a lot of the time has been providing affordable housing through rental properties and remodeling lower price rentals and fixing those up. And what's been fascinating to me is kind of a similar maybe aha that you had too. It's so interesting when you start going in depth and trying to understand the inner workings of the housing business. We our mission is to house people. Like we provide housing to people who live there and rent,
right,
or maybe buy it. But there's so many mechanics behind the scenes that make it difficult to provide, especially at the lower spectrum of the housing market. So it's been, for me, in my own local community in Clemson, I've been really interested beyond just my real estate investing business in two kind of big issues. One, alternative transportation, just making it easier for people to walk, bike, both from a equity standpoint, but also from a health standpoint, and then affordable housing. And I've actually done something about the transportation part. I've helped with a nonprofit, and we're trying to build that. But affordable housing is totally frustrating. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about it, was to kind of go back to what you've learned about the affordable housing business in particular. You mentioned that providing, housing for people who make $30,000 a year and also providing services. I want to unpack a lot of that, but maybe we could start with just the idea of like, what does it mean? What is affordable housing? Like, how would you define that? Because there's different terms floating around out there.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, there's so many different definitions. Everybody's got their own definition. I like to say, generally speaking, affordable housing is something that is priced at an attainable price point. And I think also affordable housing has a really negative connotation. Just over the years with public housing, that's what people think of as the 1960s style public housing that's in disrepair. But really, affordable housing is something that's an attainable price point. And then if you want to get more specific, it is something that where families are not spending any more than 30% of their monthly paycheck on their housing or their living expenses. And what we typically target, the income bands that we typically target based on our funding sources, we typically work with families anywhere from like 30% of area median income up to 80% of area median income. So it obviously varies. Every city's different. Whatever the average income is for that area, we just take 30% of that or 80% of that, and that's our window. So in Nashville, where we do a lot of our developments, I think it's typically somewhere from 30,000, actually really 30% AMIs all the way down to like 20,000 per family, all the way up to about 80,000 per family. And so every city's different, but that'll kind of give you a range of the families that we support.
So I'm just going to do that math. So if you had let's just use easy math. If you had 36,000 a year for a family and if they couldn't spend more than 30%, so you're talking about like, $1,000 a month in that case, or if somebody's at $24,000 per year, was that 600?
Yeah.
No, 700. Do my math right? $600 a month or so. So
yeah.
somewhere, but so I want to start with that rent number. So if somebody you're in the Nashville area, which is probably a little bit above where I am, but it's kind of similar to the upstate of South Carolina. Of course, California and New York is going to be a different story. But so a family could rent for $600 to $1,000, that would kind of, at least in our area, would be in that affordable band that you're trying to help people in.
Yeah, it's anywhere like 600 to about 1,200.
1,200, got it.
Where market rate rents are, one bedroom in Nashville is going 1,800 and above. And it's mind blowing, 2, 3, 4 bedroom are just scale up from there. And so a lot of times we're less than half of what the market rents are.
So that's an incredible, I just want to pause on that number because, if you read the newspapers, the headlines, you'll hear a lot about an affordable housing crisis, how people who are working a certain entry-level job, a blue-collar job, just aren't able to afford it. So these are the people who are trying to pay $600 to $1,200, and yet most of the new development properties coming online or just the market rate properties are twice that, 3 times that. So that's the reality that a lot of people are facing, right?
Yeah, and really, obviously developers want to, especially market rate developers, they always want to push their returns and get the best return on their capital for their investors. But also they're having to do that in part too because of construction cost increases. That's the only way to offset the construction cost increases is by raising the rents as high as possible. Yeah.
Well, I want to get into some of the practical side of things, but I think it would help me get my mind around it because I know you're in this space that try to think about it from more of a kind of a structural level. What are some of the things that make it more difficult to have affordable housing? Like, why is there this so-called crisis in the first place? Why is it that the price of housing has outrun what a lot of people can afford to pay?
Yeah, great question. So also, I think it's always good to take a step back, even outside of affordable housing. Like, why do we have an affordable housing crisis in the first place? Yeah. And it's really, honestly, it's economics 101. It is supply and demand. We just cannot build enough units for the amount of people that need the units. So there was a study done in, I think it was 2019. So right before COVID, right before the pandemic, and they said we needed 7.4 million more additional affordable housing units across the US. And I don't even know where that, I'm sure that number is substantially bigger now that we have the COVID, we have pandemic, the negative implications from that, especially on lower to middle income households, and the strain that it's put on those families. But really, affordable housing comes down to supply and demand. And the reason why is because more people are living in cities, people are living longer, and really a big part of it is we cannot build fast enough. The barriers to building new units keep rising. So you have land costs, you have construction costs, you have permitting costs, water tap fee costs, you have rezoning risk. So a lot of the multifamily or mixed-use zoned property has already been spoken for, has already been developed. So developers like myself are now having to go out and spend 1 year to 2 years to rezone land. And that's very, very risky because we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. We don't know if we'll get the rezoning in some cases. And you're basically putting in the hands of the local community who 9 times out of 10 don't want new development anyways, even though they will benefit from the jobs that are created and the people that are working in the economy. They're going to the shops, they're going to the restaurants, they're going to the libraries where these people work, but yet they don't want the housing for these individuals and these families. And so the cities put up roadblocks, the community put up roadblocks. The permitting process itself can take years. So when you add all that up, that's a lot of risk. And so developers are, just like any other investor, looks at it from a risk and reward standpoint. And so there has to be enough incentive for a developer to go through all of those hurdles and take all of that risk, both time and capital, to be able to do a development. And not to mention the other thing is construction risk. Construction costs have risen probably 15 to 20% in the last 2 years. That's hard to underwrite in your pro forma. And really, when we do developments, we don't know, right? Like right now, we're having to put in so much contingency into our construction budgets because we don't know what they will be until like a month before closing, because our subs and our contractors will not lock in pricing until they know we're going to close. So leaving that big, open possibility for rising costs there as well. Plus, it takes 2 years to build these things. So you're looking at a 5-year time frame from finding the site to 100% leasing it up. So these are very long-term commitments. And so what we're dealing with today is really not even the housing that people are working on today. It's what the housing that was in the works 5 years ago. And so we're just catching up to demand, and we're barely even to the building of unit levels that we were at pre-2008. Like we're just now getting back up to that level, but we're still haven't even surpassed that, even though the demand is significantly higher than it was pre-2008 crash. So you have all these negative pressures making it harder to develop units, but yet we need it now more than ever. So unless something is done at each one of those steps that I mentioned, then this is only going to actually get worse, which is crazy to think about. Like you think it's already bad, it's only going to get worse unless we do massive action in each one of those directions.
Yeah, that's really good explanation. And so going back, is supply and demand, which is economics 101. The supply of affordable housing is either somebody building new construction or somebody bringing on some existing housing that maybe wasn't offered affordably, but now brings it on. And that's one question I have. A lot of what I've done has been smaller scale, and a lot of investors listening to this might be kind of small scale, mom and pop kind of landlords or developers, but many of them are buying existing housing, and they're, sometimes it's on the lower price range, sometimes it's in the middle. Like, how do you think about it? The existing houses versus new construction? Is it just a matter of like the demand is such that you have to build new, otherwise it's not going to meet the new demand?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. Existing units are always the quickest to bring to market. So I think that is like the quickest and easiest way to solve any affordable housing crisis is bring on existing units. The problem is sometimes those existing units are in cities where there aren't any jobs. So in reality, we have units all over the country, but they're typically in rural or locations where there are no job opportunities. So people don't even want to move there because there's no money to be made there. And so that's part of the problem. But I think if there's a few different ways to basically add on more units, like you're saying, like there's, I cannot remember the name of the app, but we had him on Monumental. His name's Atticus LeBlanc. He's the founder. Pad Split, that's what it is. Pad Split. He's based in Atlanta, and what he does is he's created a platform for individual investors, like a lot of your audience, that can basically split up a house into 4, quote unquote units. Really, it's bedrooms, but it's like a co-living house, and they can affordably offer rent, for $600 a month per individual, and then the investor for a 4-bedroom can make $2,400 on a house that maybe previously they could have only made $1,800. But to the individual, it is a massive cost savings for them, and it's still at that affordable price point that they need. They also help people basically turn a dining room, let's say, an underutilized room into another bedroom. I think that's really smart, is multiplying the existing housing stock and turning that into more units. Also, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, is a great way to just add on existing units. Like if you already have a house, put a garage with a unit above it, and then you get the benefit of the garage and the unit. And you're helping, in essence, you're bringing on more housing, which helps really any housing units help the housing crisis, no matter the price point.
Yeah, I love those ideas too, and that's been on my mind a lot in my local community. I've gotten involved in I was on the planning commission for 2 years and kind of beat my head against
Nice.
the wall with that, and then that was an education. But one of the things I think you've talked a lot about that you've run into as a developer, but I think a lot of investors run into who want to have that smart density on existing housing, either turning an existing house into multiple units or maybe adding an ADU, is they run into this issue of zoning or
Right.
use requirements, and then I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because you've mentioned several structural challenges to affordable housing, but one of the biggest is that when you get to local regulations, I have found like people say, oh, we want affordable housing. This is really important to us. But when it comes to any kind of practical regulation changes, two of the worst words you can mention in a city council meeting are density
Yep.
and any kind of new development for we're in the student housing. So that's like the worst word you can mention. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the not in my backyard syndrome, the NIMBY syndrome, and how
Yes.
that affects a lot of what you do and what we do as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think honestly, so going back to what we were saying, like supply and demand, the biggest slowdown is friction in that whole exchange of, how we do real estate investing. There's so much friction in that process. And like you said, a big part of that friction between providing the units and the rules that you have to abide by is the zoning. That's always typically like some kind of hiccup that we always end up having to figure out for each site we do, especially even for individual investors. It's like, even if you want to do Airbnb or if you want to add on more units, you have to abide by that zoning. But I think, and I've seen some cities and some states do this, where they're basically taking proactive measures. So the planning commission or the planning staff or the city leadership will say, hey, look, major corridors along major roadways where we know there should be density along transit corridors, let's go ahead and upzone the land. Let's unlock the value and let's unlock the density that's already there. We just have to give the green light. That's the crazy thing is, like, there's a book I read and it basically said like zoning can unlock billions and billions of dollars in value, in land value. It's literally just at the fingertips of the city leaders to be able to unlock that density and help create that. But that's a tough political move to do that, because you have so many NIMBYs that basically said, hey, look, I've lived here for 20 years. This is how it's always been, and this is how it's going to be. And my city's not changing. It's like, well, really, the world is changing quickly, and people are moving to cities more than they ever have before. And we need a place to house these people, or else we're going to have many other problems. We're going to have economic problems. People aren't going to be able to move here. We're going to have homeless problems. Like the domino effect is humongous if you don't actually help create the affordable housing. So I think zoning is a huge part of that, and neighborhoods play such a pivotal role in that. Like, they have a lot to say, which, I think is good and bad, because there's a book I read, of course, I cannot remember the name of it, but it was about California and how they have such a crazy housing crisis there. And it basically said, like, every time you do a zoning hearing or a community meeting, you're just taking into account the people that already live in that neighborhood, but totally discounting the fact of the people that would be living in the new development. And nobody's asking them what they think about this development and what would the impact be on their life. And so I think that's an interesting way to 180 look at zoning and density and new development, even as much as maybe it is in your backyard. I think we all have to play a part of, addressing the problem. And that's one way to look at it.
No, I've been at so many meetings where that exact thing comes up, and it's been one of my biggest frustrations as a local activist for this type of thing, for transportation, but also affordable housing, is that the loudest in a city council meeting or a planning commission meeting, 4 or 5 voices that are loud seem like the entire like the people, the decision makers feel that pressure of those 4 or 5 voices, and that can be the difference between them making a decision to approve a development or not, and typically it's not, because that's the easier thing to do. And yet what's frustrated me in my town, and kind of looking at the upstate of South Carolina where I am, is that when you start saying no and you kind of freeze your town the way it's always been 60 years ago, and don't let it to kind of thicken up naturally without having to build, on the outskirts, then people just sprawl out. You just continue, the land keeps going out and out and out.
Yep.
And the inevitable thing that happens is you have traffic. You have lots of people like I grew up in Atlanta, and that was like the epitome of that type of development. Single family house, really wide roads, keep going out another 30 minutes, another hour. And then you have this awful traffic everywhere. And I think if you see traffic, that's kind of the epitome of what we're talking about here, is that if you don't allow some natural thickening and developing in a quality way like you do, then it's going to create other problems.
Yeah, exactly right.
Well, all right. So I'm going to get off my high horse there, and I want to get to some practical stuff, because that was helpful for me to think about from a big picture. So what you've gotten into the business of, Evan, is you're actually trying to solve some of the problem. You're saying, okay, the economics are against me. Like I would be easier for me to build this luxury development, and the numbers would work a lot easier. There's lots of people who would pay a lot of money for that. I could make a lot of money, but I'm just going to go the opposite. I'm going to go where the economics don't make sense, and I'm going to build something that people actually need. I think that's awesome. Like, so it's such that you got your mission driven business, and yet you're still in business. So like, I want to a couple questions. Number one, what you mentioned who your target market was, that kind of that price range of affordable rentals. How do you actually get the money? Maybe I'm getting the cart before the horse here, but like if the numbers aren't as easy to do as a luxury development or something, a typical market rate development, where's the money coming from to actually make this whole thing kind of go?
Yeah, great question. So it really comes down to, obviously, like, we could not offer these rents at the same construction price that it costs a luxury developer to build, or similar price. And a big portion of how we can do that is with the housing tax credit. So it's a federal tax credit. It comes from the federal government. They allocate the credit to a state housing agency. And then we, as developers, both for-profit like us or nonprofit, we apply to the state. And then we, based on whatever their criteria is, we get awarded those credits. And then we'll basically take those credits and sell the credits to a bank. And banks are actually required to buy these credits if they ever want to expand or buy another bank. They have to have a really good Community Reinvestment Act score, which basically says they can't redline certain lower income neighborhoods, and they have to invest in lower income neighborhoods. And one of the ways they can, get a good CRA score is by buying our credits. So we will get awarded the credits from the state, our project will, and then the project will sell the credits to the investor. They become our investor. And so we give them basically 40% of our costs go to them in tax credits, and then they give us that in cash equity, which helps pay for 40% of the development. And so they'll come on as an investor partner with us for 10 plus years. And then we will also, that's 40% of the capital stack. And then we have a 50% loan, and then 10% we get through either grants or local tax abatements. We'll lower our taxes. The city agrees to it for 10 plus years, and that will help us borrow additional debt to be able to help pay for the development. So between those three funding sources, we're able to offer rents that are affordable and attainable to lower to middle income families, and something that they're not paying more than 30% of their rents. But a big part of it is, right out of the gate, we're basically having 40% of it covered for with the tax credits, or the proceeds from the sale of the tax credits.
Very interesting. Okay, I want to dig into that a little bit, but just rough numbers. Like, so you mentioned earlier that, maybe you're at half of your end customer and your project. Maybe a market rate project would be twice as expensive on the rent scale, and so the whole project might need to value it twice that. So what you're kind of getting down with 40% tax credits plus 10% maybe local abatements or some kind of, we'll talk about what those are. Right. You're essentially cutting half of the cost of your project through some kind of subsidy or some kind of mechanism like that. But you're still, the other 50%, you're borrowing from just a lender who's charging you interest, just like any other developer would have, right? Right,
that's right. And the interesting thing is, within affordable, we kind of have our own niche world of investors and lenders as well. So we have lenders that offer us specific terms just for affordable housing, partially because the investors behind those lenders and tax credit equity buyers, they want to be involved with affordable housing, but also they get tax advantaged returns. Like, for example, our lenders don't have to pay taxes on the interest that they get paid from that loan. So they're able to offer lower interest rates and also better terms. So we typically get like a a 15-year term on a 40-year amortization. And, we'll probably do, like right now, I think rates are at like 4 to 4.25. But there's even, if you want to go Fannie Freddie, you could go that route. But yeah, the interesting thing about tax credits is our tax credit investor, the bank that buys the credits, the only thing that they want is the credits, the losses, and the depreciation. So they look at this almost as like a tax offset investment strategy. So they have all their other income coming in from the bank, and then they use our project where they're receiving the tax credits, the losses, the depreciation to offset their income coming in from other parts of the bank. So they don't want any cash flow. They don't want any upside. So that allows us as the developer and general partner to be able to collect all the upside of the project. We just don't get the tax benefits of owning the project.
So interesting. Okay. And so I want to go back to the tax credit again, just the mechanism, how that works. So you as a developer apply to the state. So if you're in Tennessee, you're applying to the state of Tennessee, and they have an allotment from the federal government. Now, are these, so when you apply for those, is a certificate? So it's like a grant awarding, or you're having to go through a process? Like, what is that process like to actually get a tax credit?
Yeah, every state does it differently. And there's actually two different types of tax credits. There's one called a 9%, where it covers up to 70% of your cost of development. That's uber competitive because, you basically are only borrowing like 20 to 25%. It's a very low leverage deal. But because it's so competitive, it's really hard to get an application score. And they also do much smaller projects. So they limit you because they want to do many, many 9% deals. So those are typically like 40 to 100 unit deals. Whereas we specialize in the 4% credit. So you get less credits, but they're guaranteed credits. So there's an unlimited supply. So you can almost guarantee you're going to get the credit. It's just a matter of you have to come up with that last 10% of the tax abatements, the grants, the other local funding sources. So that's really what we specialize in, because we'd rather also do larger deals. We do 200 plus unit deals. We can also think outside the box and get more creative with 4% deals. So we can do mixed use projects, which we've done a lot of lately, being able to create commercial, retail, or even partnerships with nonprofits and building them space within the building on top or actually below the affordable units above. And so that's why we like the 4%. But as far as going through the process of both of those, 9% super competitive. Every state does it differently. Every state has its own rule book. It's called the QAP, or Qualified Allocation Plan. And that QAP usually comes out every year, once every 2 years from the state agency. And that tells you, what kind of developments they're looking for, where they're looking for, what kind of amenities you have to have, what kind of rent levels, unit sizes, et cetera, et cetera. And they tell you the scoring that you need for the 9%. The 4% is less competitive. So it's not really, it's more about just being able to put together a well put together application. But that's really the process. And then once you get an award, you'll get an award letter, and then you can go take that award letter and basically sell the credits, or future sell the credits with that award letter.
Okay, so my next question was going to be some of those requirements that the credits have for you. So like you mentioned, maybe certain kind of amenities. Like are they required? What other requirements do they have that you need to make sure you build into your project? Is it that you have to rent to a certain amount of people and a certain income level? Like what other kinds of things do you have to follow?
Yeah, and it honestly depends on the funding source and the state agency. But just to give you an example, so all of our projects we have to be ADA accessible. So 5% of the units be ADA. I think 2% visual and 1% audio or auto. I can't talk audio. So we have that requirement. We have sometimes with certain funding sources, we have Section 3 or Davis-Bacon wage requirements, which are prevailing wages like during construction. With rising construction wages, that's not as big of an issue, but if sometimes that can drastically increase your construction costs. And then they'll say, sometimes each year they'll put out certain like goals. They'll say, okay, this year we want to be on transit corridors and we want to serve large families. And we want to, you get extra points if you do 4-bedroom units. So they will dictate that in the QAP, and they'll say, this is what we're looking for. This is the goal of this RFP, this request for proposals that we're putting out. So they usually issue kind of an addition, like original draft of what they're looking for, and then they let people review that. Then they issue the final copy, and then they issue the RFP where they say, hey, here's your window to apply, and this is everything you need in your application to be able to get an actual award. So that's a little bit of what they require.
So it sounds like you have to get pretty good at just understanding red tape and kind of details of applications, but then matching your business model up to something that's going to fit within their box, essentially.
Yeah, and that can be honestly the frustrating part of our business is, you work on these projects like we do for 2+ years on the rezoning and the entitlement and getting the project ready to apply for credits, and then they change the rules. And so that can be a frustrating part of it. But I think one way that we've gotten around that has been every project we do at Holladay Ventures, we do with intention. And what I mean by that is as soon as we're getting a project under contract or a site under contract or a partnership, we are talking internally as a team. We're spending many hours in meetings basically discussing and brainstorming and saying, hey, what should this development look like? Who should be our nonprofit partners? What kind of services should we operate on at the property or in partnership with others? What kind of units should we have? What should the look of the property be? What should our amenities be? Maybe we're trying to serve a certain target audience. Thinking about all that and thinking about who can we work with that, maybe it's the political side that we need political support from the mayor's office. Who can we get involved with at the very early stages? And we take that brainstorm, we put together a plan for the property. So to give you an example, we have one right now that we'll close on this summer. It's a mixed use development, and we'll actually, we're partnering with Amazon on this development. And then we're also talking to Amazon about creating a co-working and entrepreneur center in the first floor retail. We're in talks with nonprofits to help us operate that, and Amazon to hopefully help us fund it. And so bringing all that together makes that a really unique project. Whereas if we're just saying, hey, here's 300 affordable units, that's really great, but it doesn't get people as excited. It doesn't tell the story of saying, hey, this is a mixed use development. We have live work units, we have affordable housing, it's a sustainable development. We're partnered with Amazon. And by the way, we're building an entrepreneur co-working center. Those types of stories that we try to create on the front end of our developments, I think make us so much more successful at both winning grants, winning tax credits. So I think we tallied up all the grants we've applied for in the last 3 years since we've started implementing that. And we've won about 83% of the grants that we've applied for. And I think that has a big part of that is we've gotten really good at deciding the story and being intentional about our developments instead of just saying, let's do 200 units here. Okay. Break. We actually spend time thinking about it.
Yeah. And that goes back to your vision too. And just, the thing that attracted me to be interested in your project is you put that vision out there and you're intentional, it sounds like, about what this project could be, that this is a transformative project. Here's how the community is going to be transformed. And I love how you've kind of recognized the practical side of getting developments done, is that as good as affordable housing is for the community, it's not something people really recognize and see from a selfish standpoint. Well, how's that going to help me out? That's what it always gets blocked in our town. And so you're saying, okay, well, look at this co-working space, look at this retail that you're going to get. And what's so cool about what you're doing with that, Evan, is that not only is it helping the community so that they agree to implement it, and there's not as many NIMBYs saying, no, we don't want this. But this is also what a value add to your clients, to your customers who are getting to live there. They now get to be, instead of it being, that quote, public housing project from the 60s that you talked about, that was kind of the stereotype that so many people have. This is an integrated part of the community where they're getting to walk to shopping, where they're getting to be around other stuff. I mean, what a amazing kind of value add all around, and especially for your customers.
Yeah. And I think, we haven't been able to really see this play out yet, but I think long term, I think that's going to really create a lot of value to the residents. And I think that's going to compound on itself where, residents are going to tell their friends, they're going to tell their family, And that's going to create brand loyalty and community loyalty.
This was so instructional for me to learn about the financing piece of it. These tax credits, I'd heard about it, but I didn't really understand how that works. And that certain tax credits you could almost you could keep applying and get awarded them as long as you have a winning project. And then you also have the financing that has a little different take to it. There's kind of a whole market for your type of financing. Let's go back to that third piece, which you said was sometimes either some other kind of financing to help you fill the gap of that 10%. You mentioned tax credits or tax abatements. Can you talk a little bit more about how you fill that gap on your projects, including tax abatements?
Yeah, definitely. So tax abatements are honestly probably the best go-to way to fill that gap. And really, whenever we work on developments, our core focus is filling the gap, because we know we can get the loan as long as we get the tax credits, and we are pretty certain we can get the tax credits as long as we do a project a certain way. So we have 90% of it, kind of already in the works. It's really that last 10% that we always have to solve for. And so we always are talking to city leadership, like before we even enter a market, we kind of take a survey of the city leadership and say, have you guys done a pilot before? What is that like? What is the system? If you haven't, would you be open to it? Do you recognize that there's a need? We usually try to pick our markets based on them already kind of having the education or having the knowledge that there is need, because it's really hard to convince somebody that they have a need if they don't really believe in the need of affordable housing. So we look for markets where, the mayor or the city leadership or, the housing department or community development or even city council members are like jumping up and down and like waving their hands and saying, we need affordable housing. Like, those are the markets we love working in, because it just makes our life a whole lot easier. They're working in partnership with us rather than like butting head with us. And so we start off with those conversations. We say, hey, we'd like to work in your city and we'd like to help bring affordable housing. Have you guys done a pilot before? And we've actually done the very first pilot in a couple markets. I wouldn't recommend it, but because that's a whole education process, and you actually have to help them create the infrastructure and the program and the guidance and even the application, which in some ways that can work too, because you can actually kind of help form it the way your project needs it. To help.
What do you mean by pilot? I just want to take a step. Is that like a local regulation, or is that a different? How does that work?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't explain that. So tax abatement or pilot or even TIF, they're all kind of synonymous. Pilot is payment in lieu of taxes. So that different cities have different terminology, but typically it is pilot that we use for housing or mixed use developments, where the government will basically say, hey, this is a need for our city and we support this need and we want to make it happen. And basically their financial commitment to the project is, instead of giving us money or giving us grant, they will say, hey, for the next 10 years, we will abate X percentage of your taxes. So if you would normally pay $100,000 a year in taxes, now you only have to pay $10,000 or $20,000 a year. And so we'll still pay some taxes, but for X amount of time, 10 years usually, we will pay much less, like 10 to 20% of the normal taxes. And then that $80,000 that we would have normally paid in taxes, we can now borrow against that and basically take the present value of that 10-year, $80,000 a year payment and borrow that amount, an additional loan, which helps us pay for the development costs up front. And so cities see that as an investment. They say, hey, look, this doesn't necessarily cost us anything other than, the additional services that we may need to provide, but they're also getting a massive benefit from the affordable housing units. And so I think I've seen a lot more cities be open to it or do their very first pilot. It's helpful if a city's already done it and you can go through that process that they've already set up. But usually I start with city leadership, mayor's office, or a council member to get that ball rolling. And then there's also local grants. Lots of cities, like Austin just announced they're raising $500 million, $500 million for affordable housing in one city. And they're going to basically use that money for different things. But one of the things is to basically give out grants or low interest loans that are payable out of future cash flow instead of like a hard pay loan. It's just like, hey, pay us when you make some money, pay us 25% of your cash flow. And so those help finance the development as well. They help fill that gap. And so we look at all different types of grants all the time, city, county, state, even federal grants. But really the majority is at the city, county, and state level.
What I found interesting is that, when you were studying back in college and you talked about, the chemistry and biology, like you learn in finance class, like time value of money and present values. And
right.
That's just a perfect example. Like that's a very practical understanding of finance that can either do a deal or not do a deal by understanding future values and cash flows like this. It's a little bit of a, for somebody first hears that, they'd be like, what do you mean? Like, I don't have to pay taxes for 10 years and that actually adds value to me today. But that's just a good example for students out there. You're learning time value money, and this is the practical side of like business where you can make a deal happen, $20 million, $50 million deal because you understood how that works.
Yeah, I would say to everybody listening, I would say like being able to get creative with the finances, I think has helped me and help us be able to do some really fun, unique projects that wouldn't have been able to be done without creative financing. And I would also say you don't need to be an expert when you do your first deal. Like you will learn through doing deals. I was definitely not an expert. I still don't really consider myself a full finance expert, but I know enough to be dangerous, and I know by taking action.
Yeah, great advice. So I want to go back to the deal. So you've talked a lot about financing, which has been very helpful. You talked about your target market, working with local communities. I want to think about the owner of the property itself. And I know one of the things, like I'm just thinking about my local community, often the top bidder for properties is like a luxury student development who has the highest price rents, and they come in and they can pay $2 or $3 million per acre. Some other person might pay a lot less than that. How are you competitive? Are you competitive with the market rate investors on the land price itself after doing all of this other stuff we've talked about?
That's a good question. It depends on the city, the area. I would say if we're going toe to toe with a market rate developer, we are not going to be competitive. But I think there's ways that we can find advantages for us in the sites that we select. So, and what I mean by that is we typically look for path of growth or growth path. Like where is the city headed on what major corridors? And basically we're on the front end of that curve because we can go into a little bit more up and coming neighborhood, whereas a market rate developer, they have to go into pretty much proven neighborhoods for their investors and their lenders to sign off on their super high rents. They need a comp, whereas we don't need a comp within like the next 1 to 2 mile radius because our rents are so affordable. Yeah. People are going to come from all over. And so that is our inherent demand. That is our number one amenity is our rent. So I'd say we go in the path of progress and the path of growth. And really, honestly, within the 4 developments I've worked on here in Nashville, all of them have basically, once we built them, have then been surrounded by market rate developers. So thankfully, we got in there before they did. And they, now land is like 2, 3, 4 times what we paid for it. And so that's part of it is seeing where a city is headed. And then the other thing I would say is we look for competitive advantages with landowners. And so we don't go for we typically don't go for the sites that are marketed by CBRE or Cushman Wakefield. Those are going to get 500, 5,000 people looking at that site. We're going to go for the sites that are 1, less marketed, and 2, are compassionate about affordable housing, or 3, are a nonprofit that owns land that wants to collaborate on a project. So we recently closed on one like that, where we partnered with a nonprofit that owned pretty much like downtown Nashville land. Like they could have sold for a pretty penny to a high-end market rate developer, and they would have made out really, really well. They've basically been sitting on these 4.5 acres. It's like a downtown city block since 1964. And they've operated their substance abuse recovery services there ever since. And they've been very successful, but very under the radar. But they're like, we want to build new buildings. Our buildings are outdated. And when we desperately need to expand our buildings because they're having to turn away so many people. And so we got connected with them and we said, hey, let's create something that's mission aligned where we can double your building size and build you a 71,000 square foot brand new building, free and clear with no debt, no mortgage payment, and we can build 195 affordable workforce housing units, basically ranging from 20% AMI to 80%. And they can get a piece of ownership in the apartment, so they get another source of income and revenue to add on to their services. And so coming up with creative solutions like that, where you can create really a win-win and find something that, a market rate developer would just say, hey, we just want to buy it, and we can't have market rate next to substance abuse recovery services. That's what they would say, or that's what majority of them would say. But we come in and we say, hey, how can we create something that adds value to them, a long-term value, short-term value? They can stay in operation at their site while we're building on half of the site. They're operating on the other half. And then we'll actually do a phase 2 where we do more of a workforce model, where we do 80 to 120% AMI and serve that kind of middle income range that is also being priced out. But I think just trying to get creative like that, there's no way we would have been able to afford that site if we had to pay top dollar for it and had to compete against market rate developers.
So smart. And I find it fascinating too, because one of the topics I've talked about a lot on this podcast and try to get people to speak to is, neighborhoods change over time. And often, you've got words like gentrification, you've got, things, what start off as a lower income neighborhood, often with a history of problems and government and interventions that were negative for that neighborhood. Then all of a sudden they flip to the luxury neighborhood, and now they're getting sold out, and the thing completely changes. What I love about what I'm hearing from you too is like there's an alternative. Like there's a way to have maybe a stair step or a place in between to kind of put a foothold in the community while still changing it. Yes, there's a development change, but you can maintain the footprint of that nonprofit. You can maintain the footprint of the people who live there, maybe even expand, or you are expanding. If there were 10 affordable units there before, now you have 200 or 180.
Right.
Now you've got, so there's a net gain while also going back to your original proposition here. There's the impact and there's the mission of what the community is trying to have, this local community, the affordable community. You're trying to maintain that and build on it. That's really incredible.
I will say that community, we had to rezone that property as well. And the community meetings, we had 2 of them. And I think this was one of the first times this ever happened to me, where the community actually said, I hope you're not building super high-end luxury. We need more affordable housing, because we need to keep options affordable for, the next 10, 20 years, when all these market rate developers are going to come in and make it unaffordable for us, the people that live here and have lived here for the past 30 years. And I think we're going to start hearing more of that, where people are going to say, well, you can develop, but it has to be at least a portion of it be affordable, because people are realizing, they're like, well, if we don't say something, then we won't even be able to live here anymore.
Yeah. Yep. That's got a lot of forethought. That's not always happening in a lot of towns.
Yeah. That's not a major occurrence.
No. Well, so all this was really impressive to me, obviously, and I think it's really cool what you're doing, and you're making progress. And so I guess one of my questions would be, the money's out there. There's some of these financing credits. If you fit their box, there's a lot of red tape to go through. There's some financing out there. It seems like that's not the limiting factor. Like, what's the limiting factor in people like both you and maybe other businesses like you who have this mission to filling that gap that we talked about in the beginning, that $7.5 million unit or more gap? Like what's keeping this thing from really taking off?
Yeah, I think it goes back to a couple of the friction points we were talking about earlier. Is like for one, there's a huge barrier to entry to even learn how to be an affordable developer. That's why we were talking about it before we jumped on, like that's why we created our coaching program, Affordable Development Mastery, because nobody was doing it. Nobody's really teaching this. And everybody that joined our program, they're like, thank God you made this program, because there's nothing online of how to be a developer. You pretty much have to do like what I did and work for a developer for 6 years before you actually understand what's going on. So I think that's part of it. I think cities understanding and being proactive about zoning, about fees, about permit timelines, about maybe even land banking, creating more grants and incentives or tax abatements. So it's both like an entitlement and zoning side and a financing side that the cities and states really need to focus on, even up to the federal level. Like what would have been passed as the Build Back Better was to include like $50 billion in additional affordable housing funding. So this is like a bipartisan, Republicans, Democrats, everybody supports affordable housing, because they realize they're like, this affects everybody, no matter, your skin color, your income, like everybody's affected by this. And so I think there's a lot of momentum behind it, but I also think there still needs to be way more that has to be done. I think cities like Austin and Charlotte are leading the charge, and they're saying, hey, let's actually put hundreds of millions of dollars. Let's put $500 million into Austin for affordable housing. And I think corporations are getting it too. Like Amazon's put up $2 billion. Apple's put up, I think, $1 billion. Microsoft's put up a bunch of money. Google's put up money. So you're getting big name groups. CVS, I think, is in it. A bunch of health insurance companies are getting into it now. So people are realizing like their business is also affected by affordable housing, and they're starting to invest in that because they know that it will have positive benefits to the rest of what they're doing and be a benefit for their community.
Can you talk about some of the community benefits? I mean, we've talked about some of the mechanics of it, but so if a city council person in a major city or a small city is listening to this and they're like, this is something I am passionate about and I want to make some changes on that. Like, what do you see with both the projects you've been doing and also just the macro scale of seeing affordable housing when it's implemented? Like, why does a community benefit from that kind of on a macro scale?
Yeah, really. I mean, you think about like Nashville as an example, because I'm seeing it firsthand. Like all of the like Ernst & Young, Alliance Bernstein, Oracle, Amazon, major job announcements. But the reason why they brought all those jobs is because they see Nashville as affordable compared to where they came from, usually on the coast. So compared to those cities, yeah, sure, we're affordable. But as soon as all these jobs start coming to town, we're going to become less and less affordable. So eventually they're going to find a new city, wherever Huntsville, Alabama is going to be the next city. And all those same jobs that were, new and exciting in Nashville are going to be like, well, now Nashville's too expensive. It's like the coast. So let's move all these jobs to Huntsville. And so you just have this like leapfrog effect where if you don't actually address the problem and address it, early on and consistently for many years, then you're going to be like every other city that's too priced out. Like look at LA and San Francisco. Like people know that on a 1 bedroom, you're going to have to spend over $3,000 a month. Like that's just known. Like, and that could be your city if you don't address affordable housing. And then you will not be the affordable option for job centers, and you will not have new job announcements come in because they won't see you as the affordable option. So I think that's something where you have to address it early and often, or else the jobs are going to leave and people follow jobs. And that basically will really erode your whole tax base. Speaking from a city leader's perspective, that's a big part of how cities operate is tax base, job centers and people and real estate values. And so all of those are going to plummet if you don't address affordable housing, because the backbone of cities and economies are built on those making 20 to 80,000 a year. And, their wages are slowly increasing, but their housing costs are massively increasing. So if you don't address that, those people are going to move to another town. And you just have this massive ripple effect that is very costly to cities and city leaders.
Yeah, these are your teachers. These are your firefighters. These are your police officers on the beat. These are your janitors. Yeah. These are your people who work on staff at the city. I mean, these are your people making the cities work, or the people who have to live in these in regular affordable housing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and it's funny because I feel like sometimes when people hear that, they're like, "Oh, you're just saying that." It's like, no, we actually looked up the starting. It's all public information. You can look up the starting income levels for any publicly employed, any individual that works for the city. You can look up their income levels or their starting income levels. And so we looked all those up, and literally everybody you just said fits nicely into our income brackets. Like they are city officials. They're helping the city. They're protecting our city, and they can't even afford housing in their own city.
Yep. Well, I like that pitch. I hope people listen to that. I want to be respectful of your time and I want to wrap it up with going back to those of us who are entrepreneurs who are maybe motivated by this, and maybe I'm going to put a link to your resources as well if they want to check that out. The person who's developing this. So you mentioned there's a nonprofit model, there's a for-profit model. We've talked about a lot of these subsidized loans, these grants. There's obviously a business model there. Like, what's the exit strategy for the developer himself, herself, who builds this? Do you keep this property for 20 years? Do you sell it and then make a fee on that? I'm just curious, just so people can kind of wrap this whole thing back up kind of to understand it from the bigger picture.
Yeah, definitely. So the benefit from a developer's point of view, above and beyond the impact, from a financial perspective, the way these deals are structured, you don't need to bring any of your own equity. That is one of the biggest benefits of these projects is the tax credits and the equity that you get from selling those credits are 100% of your equity. So you don't need to bring your own capital. You do have to bring your own pre-development capital, which is basically gets you from getting a dirt under contract to closing and starting construction. So the size deals we do, that's typically $2 million. So we have to front that $2 million, but as soon as we close, we get that money back. And then depending on the state, each state in their QAP allows a certain size developer fee. So like in Tennessee, we get a 15% developer fee. So a market rate deal, it's typically 3 to 4%. So it's substantially more than a market rate development, but also we will roll in, half to 2/3 of our developer fee back into the project. And that's another part of that 10% of filling the gap is we roll in part of our developer fee and get paid that out of future cash flow once the project's up and running. So we really don't get paid 100% of that 15% upfront. But the benefit is you get the developer fee, and then you also get 100% of the cash flow on the back end. Now, this isn't a market rate project, so it's not cash flowing like crazy, but it is good, steady income from the property. And then on the back end, so we have to hold it for 15 years. Some groups sell them. You can also re-syndicate them, which basically means like taking them back into the tax credit program and using tax credits to rehab the project, and then basically signing up for another 15 years. That's what our business plan is. Everything we're doing to hold, and we're doing it for long-term ownership. And that way we're really like, when we can tell community leaders that from the very beginning and say, hey, look, like we want to be your neighbors for the long term. And we're building this as we're, in the mindset of we're going to own this for 30 plus years. And so that's what we're building. That's the quality we're building to. But we do plan on like year 20 to 23, call it, depending on whenever the project needs it and whenever we can get an award, we'll re-syndicate and basically rehab the property and update the property with new tax credits.
Yeah, great. Thanks for informing us on that. And so there's money to be made. This is something that you can earn a living while making an impact. You can also go a nonprofit route and have the fees fund a nonprofit that then reinvests and buys more properties. So there's just this whole world of social business to me is so fascinating. I read a book a while back, 18 years ago, that kind of motivated me in this for fun. It was called Banker to the Poor by Muhammad Yunus. And he won a Nobel Prize in making microloans to people in Bangladesh. And it just really ignited this idea to me that, we as entrepreneurs have this skill of taking something that doesn't even exist and then building something and building a business. And it can make money, and that's great too, but it can also have a hybrid effect. You can make money and make an impact, or you can be 100% all impact and the money all gets recycled. Like anything on that spectrum is what we entrepreneurs can do to help solve some of society's biggest problems, like affordable housing, like you're trying to solve, Evan.
I love it.
Yeah. Well, very cool. Thanks for your time, Evan. I want to give you a chance just to hand off. Is there anything else that you want to tell people where they could find you, connect with you, anything else you have going on your end?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me on, Chad. I had a blast per usual. Yep. So our main website where you can find out about everything we're doing is just evanholladay.com. That's HOLLADAY. And then also, if you're interested, we also partner with investors on some of our developments. And that you can find out more about at our development company website. That's holladayventures.com.
Great. I will put links to those in the show notes. We'll have a show notes page, and people can check that out either on YouTube or on the podcast. So Evan, thank you so much. I look forward to staying in touch with you on this as well, and just really appreciate the work you're doing to do these developments and also to educate everybody else about it. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you, man.
Hope you enjoyed this interview with Evan Holladay and the conversation about the affordable housing crisis. If you like this episode, please join me again next week. I have another episode, another expert and a different topic, all about screening for tenants and the process of taking a vacant house and getting it ready to rent and finding the best tenant for your property. It doesn't have to be something that's intimidating. Pam Storm is the person I'm interviewing, and she is just an awesome person, but also just explains it very easily in a way that you can get it, even if you're a brand new landlord or if you're an experienced landlord. I've learned a lot and implemented a lot that I've learned from Pam. So join me next Monday for the next episode. If you like the show, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to my free email newsletter at coachcarson.com/REI toolkit. In addition to weekly updates, articles, and behind-the-scenes tips from me, my email newsletter subscribers get my real estate investing toolkit, which includes a property closing checklist that I actually use when I buy properties, a real estate deal worksheet, a tenant screening criteria checklist, and other spreadsheets and goodies that will help you on your journey to financial independence using real estate. You can get it all for free at coachcarson.com/REI toolkit. I also want to take this time to thank some people behind the scenes who make this podcast possible each and every week. This includes my podcast editor extraordinaire, Michael Wynn, my amazing virtual assistant, Megan Thompson, my wife, Carrie, who helps me behind the scenes and is my partner here at Coach Carson. And of course, thank you to all of you, the listeners of this show who make everything possible. This show exists for you. It exists because of you. And I really appreciate you being here for another episode. Everything I've shared with you in this episode has been for general education purposes. I have not considered your specific situation or risks. Before buying your own investments, be sure to consult a financial, real estate, and/or a legal professional. Until next time, I'm Chad Carson. You can also call me Coach, and this is a show all about helping you get out of the financial grind so you can do more of what matters. See you next time.